The American colonies in the late 18th century were a landscape defined by sharp binaries. Men were the architects of society, and women were the silent foundations upon which that structure rested. For Deborah Sampson, born in 1760 in Plimpton, Massachusetts, this dichotomy was not merely a social rule, it was a physical suffocation. Orphaned at a young age and placed into indentured servitude, Deborah spent her youth as a ghost in other people's homes, observing the world from behind the lens of labor. While the men of her community gathered in taverns to debate the philosophical musings of Locke and Rousseau, discussing the radical notions of liberty and natural rights, Deborah was confined to the domestic sphere. She possessed a voracious, untutored intellect and a spirit that recoiled at the limitations imposed by her gender. She watched the news of the Revolutionary War trickle into her rural enclave. The battles of Lexington and Concord were not just historical events, they were a siren call to a life of agency. She realized that the struggle for independence was not just a conflict against British tyranny, but a chance for the disenfranchised to reinvent their destinies. The decision to leave was not impulsive, it was a slow, agonizing crystallization of purpose. She began to observe the men around her, their gait, their speech patterns, and the way they held their shoulders. She realized that identity, to some extent, was a performance. If she could master the performance, she could transcend the cage. Under the cover of darkness, she fashioned a coarse wool uniform from scraps and cut her hair, watching her reflection transform from a servant to a soldier. She became Robert Shurtleff, a ghost of her own making, prepared to walk into the fire of the Continental Army. The enlistment process was the first true test of her resolve. When she arrived at the recruitment station, the smell of tobacco and stale sweat hung in the air. To an officer, Robert Shurtleff was simply another nameless, hungry patriot looking for a way to survive and serve. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of terror and exhilaration, but she maintained a steady gaze. She was accepted. The transition from civilian life to the regimented brutality of the military life was jarring. The Continental Army was a ragtag collection of starving, freezing, and poorly equipped souls, but to Deborah it was a sanctuary. The camaraderie of the barracks was unlike anything she had known. She had to learn the nuances of being a man, the rough banter, the avoidance of intimacy, and the vigilance required to keep her secret beneath layers of wool. Living in close quarters with soldiers, men who were coarse and observant, required a terrifying level of alertness. She slept with one eye open and bathed in the most secluded corners of the wilderness, far from the prying eyes of her company. Yet she discovered something unexpected. In the uniform, she was no longer judged by the labor of her hands or her lack of status. She was judged by her ability to hold a musket, to maintain her post, and to endure the biting cold of the winter encampments. She was finally, for the first time in her life, judged by her merit. The reality of combat shattered any romantic illusions Deborah might have harbored. The American Revolution was a series of skirmishes marked by confusion, smoke, and the visceral horror of primitive surgery. During a raid near Terrytown, New York, the violence became real. The woods became a chaotic theater of musket fire. As she stood on the front lines, the fear that had been a constant companion in the camp vanished, replaced by the instinct for survival.
When a British bullet tore into her shoulder, her first thought was not of the pain, but of the potential for exposure. With a grim, animalistic focus, she crawled into the dense underbrush. Using a penknife and a sewing needle, she performed a terrifying self-surgery. The sheer agony of sewing her own flesh was tempered by the overwhelming necessity of maintaining her charade. This was the dark heart of her sacrifice, a solitude so profound that even in the middle of a war, she was truly alone. She survived, but the war took its toll. She contracted the malignant fever that ravaged the troops in Philadelphia in 1783. As she lay in the hospital, delirious and near death, the secret she had guarded with her life finally slipped from her grasp. Dr. Barnabas Binney, a man of scientific curiosity and quiet compassion, discovered the truth while treating her. He saw not a scandal, but a story of unimaginable human endurance. He shielded her from the scrutiny of the military authorities, opting to handle her discharge with the dignity her service deserved. When she left the hospital, she did not walk out as a criminal, but as a person who had looked into the abyss of war and refused to blink. Returning to civilian life was perhaps the most difficult transition of all. She had lived as a man, fought as a man, and been wounded as a man. Reintegrating into the role of a woman, a wife, a mother, and a social entity felt like stepping back into a restrictive garment that no longer fit. Yet she did not disappear. She lived with the knowledge that she had done what no one in her society thought possible. Her most audacious act, however, was still to come. In an era where women had almost no legal standing, she petitioned the state of Massachusetts for a military pension. She did not ask for a pension as a widow or an auxiliary. She demanded it as a soldier. Her petition was a masterpiece of defiance, forcing the patriarchal institutions of the young United States to recognize her contribution. Her success, granted in 1792, was a landmark moment in American history. Deborah Sampson's life serves as a bridge between the rigid constraints of the 18th century and the evolving understanding of agency. She was not a symbol. She was a woman who realized that liberty was not a gift to be given, but a state of being to be seized. By the time she passed away, she had become a legend in her own community. Her story survives not because she tricked an army, but because she embodied the very principles that the American Revolution sought to define, that individual grit and the refusal to be defined by the limitations of others are the true architects of freedom. She remained until her final breath, a soldier in her own private war for equality.